Welcome to What Matters Now, the Times of Israel's weekly podcast looking at one issue affecting Israel and the Jewish world. This week, I, Amanda Borshel-Dan, am handing the mic over to Yossi Klein Halevi. Yossi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute and an author, a thinker, and a writer for the Times of Israel and many other outlets. Recently, Yossi shared with me his longtime interest in interviewing Rabbi Irving Yitz Greenberg, whom he called one of this generation's most important Jewish theologians. Greenberg has been a central figure in the creation of a post-Holocaust Jewish identity, in establishing Holocaust commemoration projects like the Washington Museum. He's a leader in inter-denominational Jewish pluralism and in Jewish-Christian interfaith dialogue. Now, at age 91, Greenberg has published his magnum opus called The Triumph of Life, which offers a brilliant and original argument for a new understanding of Judaism. So this week, we ask both Yossi Klein Halevi and Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, what matters now?
Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, one of our generation's leading theologians, philosophers, and for me personally, my mentor, my friend, my Rebbe in helping me navigate my own post-Holocaust Jewish identity. Yitz, I'm thrilled to be in conversation with you.
My privilege. As one who's long admired your work, I'm happy to hear its reciprocal feelings.
Oh. Yitz, I first encountered your work at least 50 years ago. And it was the beginnings of what would later become your seminal idea of the third era of Jewish history. I think the essay at that time was called The Third Cycle of Jewish History. And it was published in very brief form by Klal, the organization that you founded in the 1970s. And what that essay did for me was it gave me a lifelong framework for understanding who I am as a Jew. And nothing before, nothing since has had that revelatory impact as that very brief essay did. And I've been waiting 50 years for your new book, which gives the fullest explanation of that sketch, that very brief essay that I encountered all those years ago. Your new book, The Triumph of Life, is magnificent. I felt reading it that I'm in the presence of a lifetime of thought, of struggle, and of breakthrough. It was an extraordinary reading experience for me. I had to stop every couple of paragraphs and make notes. I have pages and pages of notes, and that's not usually how I read. What was also thrilling for me was coming full circle in a way, going back to who I was as a young man, first encountering your thought, and now in my older years, encountering those thrilling ideas in their fullness. So the first thing I want to say to you, Yitz, is thank you. And thank you for giving meaning and structure to my Jewish identity. And if nothing else, I'm really glad that we have this opportunity for this interview to enable me to say that.
Thank you more than words can say. Thank you.
What I'd like to explore with you is what's remained constant in your thought, what's changed over the last 50 years, and those of us who have followed you closely all these years can discern in this book really a culmination of that process. And how you understand God, the Jewish people, the purpose of the Jewish people, good and evil, in light of October 7th. We'll come to that, of course, as well. Let's begin with the Judaism of the Third Era. And what I discern in your book are two core arguments of what the Third Era means. And first of all, just for listeners who may not be familiar with the idea, the structure that you've given to Jewish history is you've divided it into three seminal eras. The first is the biblical era, the second is the rabbinic or the exilic era, and the third is an as yet unnamed third era of a return to Jewish sovereignty and power and the emergence of a free diaspora, the reintegration of the Jewish people, as fitful as it is, into the wider world. Those are my core takeaways. But what I sensed in your book are really a distillation of two core philosophical or theological ideas. The first is that the essence of Judaism is the enhancement of life, tikkun olam, and what you've done in this book is give the much abused and degraded term tikkun olam dignity and vitality. I never thought I would be interested again in the term tikkun olam, and the book just blew me away. And the second core argument is that the third era is characterized by divine hiddenness, enabling full human responsibility in a way that we haven't experienced in the past. So those are, is that more or less?
I'd sign on for that.
Okay,
it's a good summary.
Great. So let's begin then. And by the way, I think that both of these ideas, for me, are your responses to the Shoah. This is Yitz Greenberg's Holocaust theology in its full maturation.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay. So tell me what you mean by tikkun olam that's different from the way that tikkun olam often plays out as a kind of synonym or cover for a progressive political agenda. What is tikkun olam for you?
Well, partly the book reflects, as you correctly say, a response to the Shoah. And my response is really the Jewish people's response, which is to confront the greatest outburst of death and cruelty and vicious torture against any people. And you respond to it by increasing life. And in the state of Israel, recreating life is the greatest outburst of life of Jewish history, maybe of any human history. And that is a major factor in the book. So I'll speak meta for a moment about it, because again, one of the main points I've come to see is that Judaism is not a tribal religion. It's not just a matter of a few learned and observant people with a tribal God, but rather it presents itself as a way of life and as a vision for all of humanity. And so part of the tension in the book is that tension of taking seriously the world and all its issues and seeing Judaism, despite its very concrete particularity and its profound intertwining with one people, this people, in this place of Israel, nevertheless, its implications, its interactions with the whole world. So that's the background factor for this. Now you come to the key, tikkun olam. What I came to see is, yes, there are people who trivialize it and who make it simply, as you said, a nice Jewish, kosher-style flavor of progressive politics. But the key here was to see the messianism. When people think of Judaism's influence on the world, everybody acknowledges, well, one God, monotheism, ethical monotheism, that's the Jewish influence. And of course, you have 2 billion Christians and 1 billion plus Muslims who have learned to follow that. But I would say this book is about the second most influential Jewish idea, which is messianism, meaning that this world, not the future world and not the real non-material world, which is the Buddhist or Hindu position, this world, the world of human mortality and 5 senses, can and should be repaired to the point of perfection, really. That's the dream. I may not get there. So what I came to see is that messianism, the idea you don't accept the status quo. And until you can get to the world to the level that it should be, and when I come to should be in a moment, which is fully honoring and upholding the dignity and value of all life, and in particular of human life, that until you get the world to that level, you are to, in every way, work to repair and to change the world. So it's a question of taking this world seriously and transforming it.
In the book, you refer to messianism, or the consequence of messianism, as a restlessness of the human spirit, this constant longing.
It injects into the bloodstream a kind of an unwillingness to accept the status quo and a restlessness.
It's a beautiful term.
Let's improve it and let's move forward and let's do it. Now again, messianism, I'm reminded of a conversation with David Hartman, who was a dear friend and a spiritual soulmate for much of my life.
Another mentor of mine.
He had made Aliyah many years before me, and I would come to visit him whenever I was in Israel. And one day I come in and he says to me, I've been thinking about messianism and I came to the conclusion we have to reject it. And he knew it was a central part of my thinking even at that point. I said, no, I don't want to be rejected. The basic idea is not just some spiritual perfection. The basic idea of messianism is that we're going to overcome poverty, we're going to overcome hunger, we're going to overcome oppression, inequality before the law, discrimination. We're going to overcome the sickness. I mean, the material world can be repaired. And to me, this is a magnificent vision. And what's more, bluntly, if there are 3 billion religions following the monotheism, how about 3 billion people who are in modern culture? That's what modern culture is about. It's the claim you can correct all these things, and you should, by taking power. So I said, I'm not about to give that up. He said to me, Yitz, you are sitting there in your ivory tower in New York City. I'm sitting here in Israel. He said, we have to reject it. They're crazy. In other words, they're always messianists. That in the name of messianism, they're recklessly endangering the state of Israel.
And now they're in power.
And at that time, they weren't yet in power, but they were coming. You could see them come. He said, so, don't give me that. No, you got to give it up. Well, of course, one of my besetting weaknesses is that I want to have my cake and eat it. So I said to him, no, I'm not ready to give it up yet. But he made a very important point. And in the book, I try to make that clearer. We're speaking messianism, but a messianism that is totally recognizes the natural and the real world, and not drawing upon this vision of the extremists that we can do anything we want to and God will back us up, and if we are reckless or we are overbearing or we are arrogant or destructive, doesn't matter. And if we don't have the military or political ability to pull it off, because God will step in and do the rest. And in fact, now let me say about it, I'm talking about a covenantal messianism that's realistic, that's bound by natural law and understands that it won't happen by some overriding of the natural. It has to be responsible and effective. In fact, let me come in here back to the Holocaust question. There's a great passage in Elie Wiesel in The Gates of the Forest where he goes to visit the Rebbe, the survivor. And the Rebbe says the suffering of the Holocaust, it's bringing the birth pangs of the Messiah. It's going to bring the Messiah. The survivor says to him, what? You really believe there is a Messiah, a supernatural power who will come and will transform the world and do all this? I mean, there was somebody who had that ability. Then if he was going to come, he had to come. He should have come right then. There was no other time. And if he didn't come and he chose not to come, I despise him. I reject him. Such a Messiah would have no credibility, no value. So it's too late for the Messiah to come. At which point then he says, but since it's too late to come, we will have to bring the Messiah. And to me, that's the key point here. A Messiah is not going to happen. That's the best proof of the Holocaust. And that forced me to rethink an understanding of God's control and God's interaction with Jews and humanity in the covenant. But on the other hand, that I do believe, that if we do our homework, if humanity does what it can do, and yes, this means overcoming poverty. There's an incredible calling for businessmen and economists and entrepreneurs. We can overcome, hunger. There's a tremendous calling for farmers and for irrigation and for all kinds of ways of developing food. It's overcoming sickness. There's an incredible opportunity for doctors and for social workers and for technicians. In other words, part of the beauty of that humanity really, in its present form, is making major breakthroughs in these areas toward overcoming the enemies of life. And that is what it should be doing, and that's the highest religious calling that there can be. But the key in all these cases is this power we're developing. Will you use it for life? Will you use it with restraint and limitation? Will you recognize that you're a partner? You're not a master of the universe. And therefore treat the universe with respect and not global warming and species destruction. So there's a tension, and there's the opportunity that I see in this moment.
In the book, you define modernity as the Messianic era, which I thought was extraordinarily daring, because it is also an era of apocalypse, of potential apocalypse. And for the Jewish people, we've already experienced our version of the end of the world. And so there's this built-in tension into modernity between apocalypse and redemption. And I thought it took tremendous courage to come out of the closet as a messianist. And again, especially given the degrading, the coarsening of the messianic idea in Israeli politics. And one of the themes that I feel runs through the book is this tension between how a positive idea can very easily cross the line and how a life-enhancing idea can actually become destructive and death-enhancing. And so messianism, I think, is a perfect example of that.
You know, it's like a cancer drug. It can save your life and it can poison and kill you and destroy you.
Or religion.
And that's why it's religion. Now, actually, when you say I'm a modernist, I want to say again, the modern period made major strides toward the messianic goals. But I, for one, have been saying this now for 40 years. We have to go into the postmodern period. There are all kinds of problems there, which we'll deal with. Why? Because modernity, living proof that good ideas taken too far. First of all, it's living proof of my pluralist thesis that all ideas have limits. And if you don't have limits, they get out of control. One of the main points I make in the book is that Judaism is a utopian vision. Messianic is utopian. But in the last 200 years, every utopian movement has gone bananas and destructive. In other words, that's what communism, Stalinism, that's what Nazism was. Believe you can repair the whole world.
Radical Islamism.
Radical Islamism.
Also a totalitarian movement that's trying to
why?
control
Because these
the
good
world.
ideas were taken too far. And I argue the key to Judaism's health affirmation of life is that it married the utopian vision to a particularist, incremental, small c conservative, particular personal, very much weighing human factors method, which we call Brit or covenant. And that's the genius. It's frustrating and many things take too long and there hasn't been enough transformation and change in the tradition and it's a lot of agendas there. But that combination keeps the human factor uppermost. The heart of covenant is the idea that God gives up coercion, and if we do it right, we give up coercion.
Now, at the heart of your idea of covenant is a dialectic. And this characterizes the idea of God in the third era. On the one hand, God is in a hidden mode, and the Holocaust is the ultimate expression of that. On the other hand, God deliberately steps back from direct intervention in history in order to enhance human
asking humans to take a step
responsibility. And that really is how you define covenant today. So the radical element here is that the covenant depends in its fullest expression in the third era on God taking a step back from his direct involvement.
Correct, but let me shorten that because I think that's the hardest point and the one that's most misunderstood in treating it. My argument is that, first of all, covenant is the sweet spot. Without covenant, you have a world in which God is totally controlling, but it's like a cargo cult. People don't do what needed to do to repair the world, to improve themselves. In the Middle Ages, the poor stayed poor because they promised them God will give you a reward in the next world to come, instead of trying to change the situation. So that's one danger of believing in God and making humans incompetent and passive and unable to improve their life. The danger the other way, which we saw in modernity, God self-limits and gives humans full power and full responsibility. So a lot of people interpret that there is no God. I'm the God. I'm the master of the universe. And as I said, tremendous accomplishments, industry, commerce, wealth, life improvements. And on the other hand, a kind of an arrogance that I'm God, which leads to mistreatment of the environment, mistreatment of the creation, abuse of other living creatures, and so on and so forth. So covenant is a sweet spot because it says you have the strength of God's support. And when I speak about God's hiddenness, the paradox of the whole book, and I learned this from Chazal, from the rabbis, is that God becomes hidden in order to come closer. So unlike those interpretations, and there are serious ones, that God is hidden, God's face in the Holocaust, and that's why we're suffering, I'm saying God's hiddenness is deliberate, it's loving, it's affirmative, so God can come closer and will not be intimidated or awed into being childlike, but to take responsibility. So first I want to stress, God is more present. The more God is hidden, the more God is present. What the rabbis taught us was that when God is visible, dynamic, and controlling, then you have to go to the temple. There are only a few places where you dare go and visit, see God. What the rabbis taught us is that God dials down the voltage, becomes Shekhinah, a kind of womanly, feminine, if you will, loving, close presence everywhere. In your kitchen, not just in your sacrifices in the holy place. In your bedroom, when you make love properly. God is much closer.
In the book, you call it expanding the zones of holiness.
Because I'm arguing that holiness is not something set aside or deprived or ascetic or godlike, so I'm not in there. Just the opposite. Holiness is the depth of life. In the depth of life, God, the ultimate expression of life, we meet God in those depths of life. Totally hidden, but that's our challenge, to uncover the presence and to respect it and to uphold it. So it's that dialectic. So in our time, and this is the main point I want to make, even though God is totally hidden and we're totally responsible, the opposite is true. Far from God being absent, God is there. God is holding our hand. God is sharing our pain. God is sharing our joy. God is judging. God is telling us, never mind that the majority is a dictatorship. Your truth is the ultimate truth, and they are not the masters. In the end, they are like a pharaoh. They will be overthrown. So I think that is the crucial dialectic of this moment. Full human responsibility. There are more miracles in our time than ever before in human history, but they don't occur by God intervening, overruling the laws of nature. God operates totally through human beings and through natural law.
God is present in human achievement.
Again, you have to uncover it. You can live at that level, or sometimes even worse. If you don't, you will then become arrogant and kind of your own God. So it's a tension. This is our challenge. The rabbis said God is present in all of these places. What did they do? Well, they gave you a bracha. When you ate an apple, you thought it was just a matter of chewing on a sweet fruit. They reminded you this comes from a tree, from the ground, that this God created this. So in the moment of eating the apple, you became aware of the whole web of life and how the divine creative force is present in your life.
So the paradox is that the hiddenness of God is really an invitation to perceive God's presence through all of reality.
And by the way, the only difference is that in the first era, when they were much less aware of this, God, as it were, bribes or intimidates. You get reward and punishment. If you listen, it rains. If you don't listen, it doesn't rain. Don't listen to God. I believe that we had a much higher religious level. It starts with the rabbis. They started to say the reward in this world is not that way. And it's not magic. And it's not like the Haredim false claim that if you satisfy God by learning Torah, he will stop your enemies. But rather, it's a human responsibility in action with God in their stage. I said giving hidden miracles. But I'm arguing in this third stage, when God is totally absent, that means every single place, only you have to uncover it. When you are curing the patient, when you are creating a new work of art, when you are overcoming poverty and lifting up a person. In that moment, how do you become tuned into? Maybe we need to make new blessings. Maybe we stop and meditate. Maybe we just have to sensitize ourselves. But here's the opportunity for a massive expansion of holiness, meaning the depth of life and the pleasance and the richness and the upgrading of life. In that moment, one really encounters God, not awesome and not intimidating, but as sustaining and as present, and as giving strength to the vulnerable, giving strength to the oppressed, giving strength to the dissident who is in jail and seems to be totally crushed by the system. We have a different answer.
So in the book you write the following: the Lord self-limits so that humans can grow and enlarge their God-given capacities in order to participate fully in the project of Tikkun Olam. And then you write, human agency is the most important piece of the covenant of life in modernity. Now, in the book, you address two wrong turns or two wrong responses to this divine invitation to enhanced covenant. The first is what you spoke about earlier, which is the rise of human arrogance, which culminates in totalitarianism. A human being is God. The second is a very strong critique that runs through the book of the Haredi response or non-response to this divine invitation of self-empowerment in the Third Era, and how that expresses itself in a calcification of halakha, of Jewish law. And now you have a Haredi background. And before we get to the critique, what did you learn from your years in Haredi yeshiva?
Let me confess here, it's a well-taken point. I grew up in a modern Orthodox home. My parents were immigrants from Poland. My father's a big Talmud Chacham,
a very learned
Jew who taught Talmud every day of his life. And he loved it. It was the most important thing in his life. But he, in principle, fully accepted the importance of becoming American, becoming modern, getting educated, and so on. I had this lucky break. I was going through the standard modern Orthodox educational system, which, again, I say in general, I loved my life as a real Orthodox Jew. I loved observance, and I loved learning. My father, who was a Litvak and a kind of raised in the tradition of the learned Jews, he never had personal chit-chats. He didn't understand. He thought, it's a waste of time. You should be learning. The beauty, the upside of that was, because he was a loving man in the end, is that he couldn't express his love in normal words or share sports interests. When he wanted to tell you he loved you, he would sit down and learn Gemara with you. That's why I got to love Gemara, and why wouldn't you have? So that was the strength of him, but I was going the modern Orthodox way. And in truth, there's a lot of my friends and peers becoming American meant giving up the tradition, meant drifting away, it meant losing the sense of religious obligation. So I had this lucky break, totally unplanned. I stumbled into this yeshiva called Beis Yosef, which was a offshoot of the Musar movement of 19th century Eastern European Orthodoxy.
And it was the Novardok.
Novardok. In fact, they were the extremists in Europe, although by the time I met them in America, they'd gone through the concentration camps and they'd gone through Siberian slave labor camps. And ironically enough, it kind of mellowed them. So as difficult, as challenging as they were not crazed in ways that back in Europe, I think I would have revolted immediately. But anyway, I stumbled into them, and what they gave me was two things that I never will ever be able to thank them enough for. One is they really had a profound and deep sense of God's presence, of God's connection, which they expressed in their words and their behavior and their prayers and their interaction. Equally important, maybe more important, given contemporary Haredi behavior. The Musar movement is focused on character development, on developing human nature, on dealing with this unconscious forces that drive us, meaning that the most important thing was to become a human being. The founder, Salanter, once said, the Torah came to make a mensch. So they worked on it, and literally, I suspect they didn't let me into the inner circles, but they did let me into some of the circles that worked on self-correction and worked on character development, worked on self-critique. And I feel that they communicated the centrality of the relationship between human beings, of the ethics and of the responsibility of the Torah it wants from each person. And that's a gift. And they made clear that's more important than intellectual learning, or more important than even ritual perfection. Although ritual perfection too, their point was not to go through external motions, but to turn it personal and individual and internalized. That was an amazing gift, and I was always grateful to them. That having been said, and again, I look back, they were early examples of Haredim, and as the Haredi world became more and more entrenched, it frankly became more reactionary and more arrogant in many ways. They were much more reserved and much aware of the limitations of their positions and so on. So my critique of the Haredi is that, in effect, it started with the feeling that you can't deal with modernity because it'll undermine the religion, and therefore you have to shut it out. So for the sake of God and the tradition, they try to shut it out. But this was so artificial and unreal. In order to keep that ghetto safety, they had to turn reactionary, refuse to recognize the dynamic of halakha. In self-protection, you see the glorification of the Gedolim, of the great rabbi, when the Gedolim were the authors of the greatest catastrophe of Jewish history, meaning that when Zionism started, they said it's prohibited, you have to wait for the Messiah, and as a result they encouraged millions of their followers not to go to Israel, and how many of them could have been saved?
Well, this was my father's critique as a survivor. He never forgave the Hasidic rabbis, especially the Satmar Rebbe, who was the rabbi of his town. He blamed the Satmar Rebbe, frankly, for his friends' deaths, because he had friends who wanted to go to the land of Israel, and the Satmar Rebbe forbade it.
Even during the Holocaust, the Satmar Rebbe refused to allow his own people to cooperate with Zionists. They had escape routes. At that point, had escape routes. He wouldn't let them participate. The sheer arrogance. So again, precisely so. In other words, many people who could have been saved who died. And again, the final irony is his final betrayal. At the end, to save his own skin, he got the Zionists to help evacuate him personally, abandoning these people. Now, sort of my point is, in a democracy, if you lead such a policy, good or bad, and I'm not even saying that no one of us could imagine Hitler would come in the Holocaust. But my answer is, if you have a policy and it has a disastrous effect, then you resign or you're finished politically. In this case, the opposite happened.
Doesn't work in the state of Israel either that way.
They were given unlimited power in their community. And of course it doesn't work. In fact, the Haredi claim, and this is the way they justify it, that as long as we satisfy God, which is very, what I call first era Judaism, if we satisfy God, God will knock off our enemies, will drown the Egyptian army, will smash the Midianite army. Famous case in the book of Judges, Gideon is called to lead the revolt against Midian. He rounds up several thousand soldiers. God or the prophet tells him, send them all but a few hundred, because when you're going to win, when God's going to make sure you win, we don't want it to be said that 1,000 soldiers won, because that means they did it. Everybody should know, so few soldiers, only God could have done it. But that line, if that were practiced today, Israel would be wiped out in a minute. In other words, if all the Israelis would not go to the army like the Haredim, we'd be wiped out overnight. And so it's not intentional, but it's a kind of a vicious. You turn religion into a cover for self-centeredness, for evading responsibility, for ignoring the ethical fallout of wrong laws, as in the case of Agunot. In short, for the best of intentions, they've gone down a road that betrays fellow human beings, and therefore, in my judgment, betrays God's. But that's, again, a warning, like I said, about modernity. Some of the best ideas in the world, faith in God, trust, commitment to tradition, if they're not put within their proper limits and exercised properly, they can turn to be the enemies of life, the enemies of value.
So by rejecting God's invitation to enhanced partnership in the covenant, Haredim really are guilty of a third-era heresy.
You can call it heresy. What bothers me more than the word heresy is in their refusal to serve in the army. Or in the case of the Satmar you mentioned before, how about when the 67 was looming and we all were, God forbid, worrying that Israel could be wiped out in another Holocaust? The Satmar Rebbe said to his followers in Israel, leave right now. God is about to destroy Satan, that is to say, the state of the Israel, and save your own lives. To me, this is the ultimate sin, particularly after the Shoah, to abandon Jews to a fate of death and destruction, which is to say, I'm quoting Rabbi Soloveitchik, the covenant, this partnership that I talk about, has two levels. The basic level is the covenant of fate, shared history, shared responsibility, shared suffering, shared action. They have basically, in my judgment, many times crossed that line. And in so doing, they really raise question whether they have a right to be part of the people of Israel, whether they have not betrayed it. Again, I don't want to sit in judgment. What I want to do is correct them. I want to get the rest of the Israeli population and the rest of the Jewish population to respect them and put them in their place, but to help them grow up and break out of this dead end and to become part of the religion and of the people as we should be. But their present policies are what called Chil Hashem. They degrade the name of God. They violate. They have turned religion into a synonym for an excuse to evade responsibility, to get special favors which you deny to other people, to become welfare recipients rather than productive members of society. So yes, that needs to be corrected, because as one result is that the religion itself has been defamed. Talmud says, what's Chil Hashem? What is the desecration of God's name? People say, that's what the religion is, that's what God is, I don't want to have anything to do with that God.
So if I would have asked you 50 years ago, as we say in Hebrew, Yad al Halev, hand on your heart, do you really believe in God? What would you have said 50 years ago?
No, so again, the honest answer is, I grew up in a religious home. My mother really had a very elemental relationship to God. I remember when she would light candles Friday night, she would sit there and she'd have a conversation with God, and she'd mention each of her children and later grandchildren, what they are, where they are, what their problems, what do they need, what should God do for them. I mean, it was the prayers that she said. Having said that, and enriched by the experience of Novaradak, having said that, the whole Shoah totally knocked me off my stride. It shattered my world. And yes, the honest answer is, when I experienced the total abandonment and the total destructiveness and the total evil, there were days or periods when I could not believe in God. It's not a question of belief. I could not experience. I felt I was living in a world where there was no God, there was nothing, there's no values. It's a jungle of the worst kind. And the truth is, I've come somewhere from there, but there are days and there are moments, even now, and never always will be, because the truth is, and I came to understand that's what the prophets are talking about. You're living in a world in which evil triumphs. It can't be a God. The prophet's vision, that's the book, as long as there's death, loved ones, people, precious, infinitely valuable, unique people die. Before we get to natural death, how about war and sickness? Then in that moment, God is not present. You can't feel it.
What moved me so deeply about your book was its profound faith in God. And the move that you've made is you're no longer asking the question with anguish and anger, where was God? You've provided a kind of almost alibi for God, that in redefining the covenant for the third era as this movement of God deliberately withdrawing to allow enhanced human responsibility, you're shifting the question from where was God to where was humanity in the Shoah. Now, I never liked that formulation. It always felt to me glib. We grew up on that. I had rabbis who would say that, don't ask where was God, where was man? And it upset me. I said, okay, yeah, we'll get to human beings, but let's talk about God too. And what you're doing here is you've allowed yourself to re-embrace a loving God, and in a certain way, an all-powerful God, because your God is not the God of process theology necessarily, at least not the process theology in which God is not capable of intervening. This is a more complicated move. You're saying that God is capable of intervening, but chooses not to for the sake of encouraging the evolution of humanity.
Well, that's the intervention. In other words, again,
that's the intervention, is to restrain himself.
Right. Again, I must say, as long as you understand, we're talking 20%, 80% of the time. There are times when we're back to the primitive, earlier stage, when I can't accept it and I'm very angry, or
angry at God, at God's hiddenness,
angry at God's failure to step in and do something. In other words, or angry at the feeling of the total absence and the reality of the total absence. But having said that, most of the time now, yes, it was one of the keys. I came to see that God suffered too. In other words, it's not that God was standing there and we're being tortured. That is a profound insight of what rabbis already saw. Or the quote, the Psalms, Imo anochi b'tzara, when humans are in suffering, God is with us in that suffering. So the realization that God was choking, asphyxiating, involuntarily defecating in the gas chambers was a tremendously powerful thing. And I still remember one experience I had. It was a day I put on my tefillin and I couldn't pray. That happened many days in those days, early days particularly. And somehow in the interaction, it suddenly hit me that in fact, as painful as I felt empathetically, think of the pain of the people themselves and think of the pain of a God sharing that pain. Only this God is infinitely more emotionally conscious. So imagine that there's a wonderful passage in Sanhedrin. The Gemara says, when a human being is suffering, even a bad person suffering, being punished for being bad, but God says, my head is splitting. My arm is breaking. So the God, divine suffering is multiplied. In that moment, the anger turned into almost compassion or pity. And I realized you have to play that back both ways, that God feels compassion and pity for me and my suffering. And so again, it moved me in a different direction. I also have to say, and again, it's not a simple faith. If you let yourself sink into life, you get to realize that you're swimming in the sea of the divine. That's the Jewish claim. Human being is the image of God because we grow in the ground of God. We don't see those levels of existence. But it's available, and if you can tune into that, to me, it becomes a tremendous sustainer of life and of dignity. And yes, it's one of the great gifts of Judaism to humanity. Again, keeping in mind the limits. When you start turning that into, I depend on God, I have bitachon, if I don't try to change the world, or if I depend on God to make a miracle and zap that cancer, it's not going to happen, and it shouldn't happen. Or at least, to put another way, a loving parent, as the child becomes more capable, gives them more and more autonomy, more and more responsibility. Because my dream at the end is to raise a child not dependent upon me. I'm not going to be a helicopter parent. God is not a helicopter parent, but rather take the person fully responsible and fully challenging.
Okay, but your child is not praying to you. Who do you pray to? What are you hoping for when you personally pray to God?
Well, so first of all, that's a good and very important point. The implication of what I'm saying is that a lot of the prayers or a lot of the religious activity right now is to tell God to do a miracle and, to give me money, give me wealth, or to give me rain when there's a drought. Those prayers, in my judgment, are no longer valid. The only way you can say them, I say them in many cases because I want to carry on the traditions of my ancestors and I feel part of their unfinished covenant toward the final messianism. But you have to understand them differently. Put it this way, when I pray in the morning, it says, God is, Oseh Mishpat, does justice for the oppressed, feeds the hungry. So my prayer is, you as God's agent, that's your agenda, that's your responsibility. So
But what is God's role in
so
that?
The main prayer, as I see it, will become not the prayer of request, bakasha, but the prayers of praise, acknowledgement and gratitude for life, acknowledgement and appreciation of the beauty of nature and of the richness and of the excitement and of the fulfillment in life. That's my prayers, and I acknowledge that God is part of it and enables it and sustains it. Shechiyanu v'kimanu, and sustains it.
So praise is considered to be the highest form of prayer because it's completely detached from my own personal needs.
Hold on 1 second. Yeah, something bluntly, I'm saying again, we're at a higher level. A lot of that praise in the first stages is frankly, it's TLing. It's
you're gonna have to explain that phrase. I'm not sure that people of this generation know it.
It means flattering God. It means trying to. How do you say that?
That's also a BTA expression.
How to close and how to come closer. How to play up to God to win God's favor, right? Because of weakness and because the whole theme of reward and punishment. At the mature level, God doesn't want that. At the mature level, as a parent, I don't want my child to be constantly praising me in order to show me gratitude for how much money I gave them or how much whatever I did for them. I want my child to respect and love me for my values.
It's praise for the sake of gratitude, not for the sake of buttering up the deity.
Thank you for the word. A lot more kosher word, buttering up. So I get it. And again, I'm not trying to put down the past. Each generation functions in its own reality. In the reality of Mesopotamia, I understand how they turned to God to help them, as the Mesopotamians turned to Baal or whatever, Canaanites turned to Baal to give them the rain. But, and this is the greatness of the tradition, as they become more mature, more sophisticated, God speaks to them in that language. Like I pointed out, the rabbis say that the reward of doing the mitzvah for the direct reward in this world doesn't happen anymore. So if there's a reward, it's a reward to come, for which they were trying to get us to see that in the end there is justice, and even though in this world many times it ends with injustice and they get away with it. So I wanted people to understand in the end you don't get away with it, but the ultimate stage we're at, we do it out of love of God, out of relationship, out of love of fellow human beings, out of love of the vision of a world of full dignity and a full life. And that, to me, that's what a parent would dream of. That my child should grow up, internalize these values, my values, the good, best values, and carry them out. In fact, when I say best values, there's room in the tradition for improvement on what we had from before. So again, I would want that my child, that where my parents, where I fell short, they understand and lovingly and respectfully want to go to the next level, which I didn't get to, but they understand that I would have gotten there if I could have. So that's exactly where we're living. It's a very dynamic and powerful. And again, I keep stressing one more implication. God's total hitness is so that the atheist, the agnostic who doesn't experience this, is not an outsider, is not reprehensible, is not stupid. They are reflecting and experiencing a reality which they have, namely they don't experience God controlling and shaping. So my answer is they are fully welcome. If they take responsibility for the covenant of fate, you can be a good Jew and be an atheist. You can be a good Jew and not accept the ritual obligations. If they're properly done, I believe, the ritual obligations educate, uplift, direct in the right way, and therefore they have a major contribution. But they are not the ultimate. The ultimate is not what God wants us to worship God. The ultimate is God wants us to treat God's creatures with full love and full responsibility.
So we're speaking now very close to the first anniversary of October 7th, which for me in some sense really marked the end of the post-Holocaust era. The post-Holocaust era where the Jewish people felt reasonably protected by the memory of the Holocaust, certainly in the West. And what has changed is that the Holocaust is now being turned against us. We are the new Nazis. And this coming right after we experienced a kind of pre-enactment of our enemies' genocidal intentions. And I wanted to ask you this as someone who played a seminal role in establishing the Holocaust as an active part of contemporary Jewish identity, your partnership with Elie Wiesel for many years, your seminal role in founding the Washington Museum for Holocaust commemoration. And now we're at a time where we're experiencing really what Soviet Jews experienced under communism, which was the inversion of the Holocaust, using the Holocaust against the Jewish people. My question to you, Yitz, is, are we experiencing a failure of Holocaust education? This generation arguably has been more exposed to Holocaust films, art, commemoration, education, and yet the takeaway of so many young people is that we are the heirs of the Holocaust, but on the wrong side. So, second thoughts about Holocaust education?
I'll go back in order. I start with my basic belief that the Holocaust is an event of destruction and Israel as an event of redemption, exodus, of our lifetime. Both are of such proportion that they are central to self-understanding as a Jew and self-understanding as a religious person. Just like Exodus is the center of our religious understanding through Pesach and through Shabbat and so on. So I believe Holocaust and Israel both will become a central part of our self-understanding as Jews.
In other words, it's the awareness of the link between those two events is only going to deepen.
I believe that, but my point is both these events should become as central to the daily life and daily understanding as the Exodus, as the basic Jewish teaching of Shabbat and so on. They'll become equal. I start with that. Even if it doesn't work or if it's misused, doesn't matter. My point is, if we are serious about responding to God and to the events of Jewish history as part of this covenantal drive to someday repair the world, then this has to become a central part of it.
What do you mean, even if it's misused?
If it's misused, well, misuse is what we are talking about. The answer is, so again, I am disappointed. I also had this fantasy that the Holocaust consciousness would protect us from this kind of renewed anti-Semitism, renewed really exterminationist attitudes toward us and so on. I am disappointed, but again, my answer is no guarantee and there's no magic formula. Human beings can take the best and distort it.
It's a classic example of what we were speaking about earlier, of how the best, or how something that's intended to enhance life can be used.
Can be misused. That's number one. Number two, more important, the truth the Jewish people did respond correctly, and the human beings of decency and of spiritual or ethical sensitivity joined them. And the Holocaust Museum is a good example. In other words, the United States recognized an event that happened 7,000 miles away, and the United States was not the one who inflicted these good. There was a failure of responsibility, but there was certainly not initiative or agency. It could have walked away and ignored that. When we were building the museum, I still remember Henry Kissinger asked for a private meeting off the record, came to see us. And he said, I heard a rumor that you are planning to recommend on the National Mall, on the most sacred central place of America, a museum about the Holocaust. He said, stop, this is madness. You're going to endanger the whole Jewish people. I said, what are you talking about? He said, you know what the answer is? He said, it didn't happen here. America didn't carry it out. You're going to build this thing on the National Mall, on the sacred ground of America. No one's going to come. And so people are going to come by and say, what is this doing here? By what right? Those Jews, those nefarious Jews, they grabbed control of the government. They built this thing in the most sacred place.
There certainly are people saying that.
So he said, you're going to unleash anti-Semitism you can never imagine.
It's a great window into his soul.
To him, I said, why are you so sure no one's going to come? He says to me, because Americans only like happy endings, and this is not a happy ending, sir. Now, I thought of it many times. Why do I think of it? First of all, because it turned out this is the third most visited museum on the mall. The third most visited museum on the mall. That means 80-90% of the people coming are not Jews. That's number one. And number two, more important, overwhelmingly when we did these surveys, what do you feel when you get through with this? People warned us, it is a course in how to kill Jews,
which is what Kissinger was afraid of.
But the opposite, 80% sign, I come out here feeling, what can I do to protect democracy?
Yes, what can I do to protect democracy? Not necessarily what can I do to protect the Jewish people.
It brings us to the problem, which is real. Now, but my first, given that we did the right things, namely created a state of Israel, and for that matter, created Holocaust memorial centers, given that truth, October 7th, as catastrophic and as shattering as it is not the Holocaust. That's my point. Because you know why? Because the Holocaust, that happened every day for 5 years, and no one stopped it. What happened here was, after one terrible, terrible, horrific day, the Israeli army got its act together and eliminated these people, and we started the war. So my first point is, already the Holocaust and Holocaust consciousness has prevented repetition. Now, it's also true that these ideas are out there available, and yes, there are people who have used this imagery to undercut, and it's a kind of a brazenness, it's a kind of a chutzpah, in which you take the victim's suffering and use it as a cudgel to justify murder, rape. So my answer is, it's not a failure of the conversation, it's a challenge to recover those ideas or to reassert them in their proper fashion. And that's one of our tasks. I'll give another example, to put it bluntly. We learned from the Holocaust that Jewish faith is not just Jewish faith, although it's distinctively in Jewish faith. We also learned that it shows much broader processes in the society. In other words, the Nazism was a sickness that exterminated the Jews, but also killed millions of others, also oppressed and destroyed the institutions of freedom and dignity and so on. My point is that the radical left has slipped into this trend, uses the Holocaust to defame and to validate and to justify and to enable attempted genocide of Jews, shows that the left is sick. And that the left has, and I'm speaking as a person of the left, my answer is, looking back, yes, it's very painful that Israel is almost a pariah state and that in the media and in the popular progressive areas, in many areas, it is misrepresented and presented as a pure oppressor, etc. But I believe that in good measure, it reflects the breakdown of standards and of ethical judgment and of meritocracy in those radical left. And therefore, my judgment, there's no alternative but to fight it and win it back. Otherwise, in my judgment, it will disintegrate. In other words, the left will become totally historically relevant. If I can give an example of that, after World War I, the left, and the college students in particular, turned pacifist because, again, I don't blame them. There were so many millions who died in this war. And look, so in the 30s, when Churchill said you can't appease, you have to fight back, they called him a warmonger. And then in the Oxford Union, they boycotted him and they insulted him. So my answer is 20 years from now or 50 years from now, I believe we will save the left. People look back and realize this was a period when the ethical judgment was twisted, when the notion of oppressed and oppressor and anything the oppressed do is okay and anything the oppressors do is wrong, that will prove to be wrong and a disaster for the whole society, not just for the treatment of Israel or treatment of the Jews. There's no guarantee. And again, the part of the third era, it's exciting to me. It says that we have the opportunity in Jewish history and in human history of achieving unparalleled redemption, unparalleled human dignity. In my lifetime, 2 billion people have been taken out of poverty. It's an amazing accomplishment. But of course, there are 6 billion left, and so on. So my answer is, this is an opportunity, and at the same time, God has given us freedom. It really means that you don't have a guarantee the good guys will win. If we have bad leadership, if we have, as I feel right now, an extremist Israeli government that follows policies that threaten democracy, that undermine equality and judgment and dignity of Arabs and so on, that simply want to oppress Palestinians rather than see if, again, the Palestinians are to blame here, so I'm not saying it's all our fault, but we should explore a way of leading the Palestinians away from extermination and terrorism toward living in peace and building a better life for themselves. If you have that, a lot of things could go wrong, God forbid.
Well, you had a beautiful line in the book that being Jewish is a heroic act. I have pages of questions which will remain for now unasked. And I just want to conclude by thanking you for your heroic Jewish life.
Well, let me rephrase that. I think this is the heroic age of the Jewish people, and I am in awe of the numbers who are willing to step up and take that responsibility. And let's hope for the best. That's Jewish message. Od lo od tikvatenu. Let's hope that we will win through, and not just for us, but for the whole world.
And I'll end by urging our listeners to read as soon as possible The Triumph of Life by Rabbi Yitz Irving Greenberg.
Thank you.
A book not just for this era, but I found reading this book specifically now, post-October 7th, was great comfort and a source of strength. So thank you, Yitz.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to What Matters Now with guest host Yossi Klein Halevi. This episode was recorded in Jerusalem's Nomi Studios and produced by Zev Levi. If you have any comments or questions about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. I'm Amanda Borshel-Dan. Until next week, Shalom.